and appreciate you all joining this session. I, as Roger mentioned, work in the mayor's office. I sit on the policy team as a deputy policy director, and food security is one of the um, issues that falls into my portfolio. And so I just have a couple of slides here to walk through. I really don't want to spend too much time, but do want to give a little bit of a context here. And maybe before I jump in, I'll just do a little bit of the context setting. I'm hoping to, this session is really a preview, or what I'm about to share is really a preview of what we are looking to be announcing much more or more broadly and publicly around the mayor's food equity agenda, hopefully in the next month or two. Um, as as Roger helped frame a little bit, this is work that's been building on a lot of the work that many of you and a lot of a lot of our partners / the others of this panel have been working, have been developing in the past, or plans that people have been building in the past. So actually, let me just start going through some of the slides. I will make sure I can advance them. Yes. So this is probably not anything new to folks who are participating, or to all you who are in the panel. But I just wanted to start with an acknowledgement and a point, and starting from the point of understanding that food insecurity is long lasting and has its roots in poverty and structural racism. The story of how we got to this point of having a food equity agenda doesn't start with, but at least this part of the chapter starts with the beginning of the pandemic, when a lot of existing food insecurity rates were exacerbated and made even more clear to more people. And so, as a part of some early pandemic emergency food response work, there was a recognition that the city could and should have both a more coordinated system or approach for how we approach food systems or emergency food in particular issues. And also we recognize the need for some larger structural changes to be put into place to help get to the root causes of food insecurity as well. And so that is where this short-term food policy advisory group came out of. So it was a sort of an outgrowth or an interim step coming out of some emergency food response work that the city began to coordinate during the pandemic. And so we worked with our partners at the Greater Chicago Food Depository, Nicole, who was also on this panel, as well as a number of other partners, including Erica and Anton as well, who are also on the panel, to form this food policy advisory group, which had a couple of goals. One was to advise on what the city's food, vision statement should be for how we advance food equity and food justice across the city. One thing that was made, that I heard loud and clear at that point, was that we have, or that plenty of plans already exist, and a lot of good work has gone into developing different plans, both within the city and across outside the city, and across partners outside of the city, around what should be done or what needs to be done in order to have a more equitable food system. So our intent with this advisory group was not to build a whole new plan, but rather address some of the shortcomings that we heard had come out from previous efforts. Some of the ones we heard were around transparency and accountability to actually implementing plans. And we also wanted to, through this process, identify some short-term priorities that we would collectively advance as a city and community stakeholders in 2021. So that was the second goal of this group, was to develop to identify those priorities, looking back at all the different plans that had been put into place, looking back at all the recommendations that have already been developed, and in the moment that we were in, or that we are in this pandemic, um, just pick a set that we could focus on and advance while we also work towards some long-term solutions. So one of the other goals that I'll highlight was around this long-term structural solutions, or rather the need for a governance body, which is something that we are also working to stand up and launch in the coming months. And again, this actually, I will say a little bit more about it in a little bit. Um, but just to give you a sense of how we as a group started organizing ourselves, was around looking at these 6 different priority pillars, food system wide, that are um, not just focused on the emergency food system itself, but looking across all of these other areas, right? So there's the emergency food system. There are maximizing existing nutrition benefits and programs such as SNAP or WIC. Looking at the production of food, urban agriculture, community gardens, looking at how we procure, how the city and other large institutions within Chicago procure food that is healthy, grown by Black, Indigenous, people of color, growers, etc. And then there's also 2 other pillars around access, or unlocking retail access, as well as using food as or leveraging food as an engine for inclusive economic growth through empowering employment and entrepreneurship. So these were the 6 pillars that helped guide a lot of our work, or our thinking, really as a group. And so to give you a sense of the process that we went through, um, as I mentioned, we reviewed past food plans and policy agendas, and that's how we got to those 6 priority pillars that I mentioned. We engaged with different subject matter experts, looked at past initiatives for what lessons could be learned, and tried to take stock of where we are currently as a city and what our opportunities are for making some meaningful change in the short term. So through that, there were a whole bunch of different actions that we identified, that we started to assess as a group and screen those for which would be high impact and feasible to advance in the short term. So through this whole process, which we did with this advisory group, we landed on ultimately 5 high impact priorities that we would focus on to advance in the next year. And just to give you a little flavor and a preview, those 5 priority initiatives align heavily with the pillars that I just mentioned a few slides ago. And they include eliminating barriers, zoning or other regulatory barriers to the expansion of the city's food pantry system, so that we can more easily and more quickly open up new food pantries in neighborhoods where there is unmet need or where there is greatest need. A second priority is around really maximizing existing federal nutrition programs and benefits. Um, I know for me, it was it felt like a big missed opportunity to know that there are so many SNAP benefits, for example, that we miss out on as a city because people who are eligible are not enrolling, have not enrolled, or they face barriers to enrollment. So we identified that as another priority for the year. A third is around back to the procurement piece and leveraging both the city's procurement and other institutions, so hospitals, universities, other large systems, to more explicitly target or have some targets or goals around supporting local BIPOC growers and producers. A fourth priority was specifically looking at urban farming and agriculture, and how we can eliminate barriers for those efforts, for those community-driven efforts as well. And the last is around back to the food business and entrepreneur piece, and especially BIPOC-led and owned businesses, to support their growth in the future recovery, or the needed recovery for the city. And one particular barrier that was flagged, I think often comes up in a lot of conversations of equitable business growth is around access to capital too. So again, this is really just a little bit of a snapshot and a preview of some of the work that we're hoping and planning, I should say, to advance this year. The last piece I'll highlight before passing it on to the rest of the panelists is around this governance body that we have also been talking about and working to develop. So one other big challenge that came up or that we heard was around the decentralized nature of Chicago's food ecosystem, where there are a lot of players, even just on the city side. I've lost count how many departments are involved in different aspects of the food system, and obviously outside of the city as well, with so many of all of you as our partners too. So one thing, thinking of that as a challenge to overcome, one other outcome or outgrowth of this advisory group is the creation or the intent to create this cross-sector governance body, something that we are calling or thinking of as a food equity council that would help us move from largely, looking at the left of the slide, being a largely disconnected or not centralized constellation of departments or organizations working on food-related issues, to be one that is more cohesive, that is more transparent and accountable also to residents and communities around advancing a vision for a more equitable and just food system. So that is how we also got to this proposal around having a food equity council that will help bring that transparency and accountability, that will act as a facilitator and a convener of multiple city departments, city agencies, sister agencies, food partners from across the food system. That council would help develop a shared policy agenda across the food system issues that we've just went over, and also lead the implementation and coordination to move all of this work forward. So I'll stop there. I think this has been very exciting work for me personally, and for the mayor and the mayor's office overall. And I know there's a lot of work ahead of us. And I'm excited for what we've been able to start coming together around over the past several months with the partnership and leadership and generosity of all our partners at the table too. So I'll stop there. There will be more information shared about these efforts and this agenda in the coming months, as I mentioned, but excited to have this opportunity to share it with you all today too.
Great, thank you so much for sharing all that hard work and information to this point with the council and all the collaborators to get here. I'm going to turn it over to Nicole Robinson from the Greater Chicago Food Depository.
Hi, Roger.
Hey. Let me get you spotlighted here. There we go. And if you could give some, from your perspective, from the Food Depository, about the value of this work and collaboration and council moving forward, and some of the reflections from the last year and the impacts of the pandemic for you all.
Absolutely. I think I'm excited about this council for a number of reasons, but March marks nearly 1 year that we've all been at this work. And if there's any one unifying theme beyond just the pandemic itself, is justice and equity around food and what that means to families. We all know that, Juan Sebastian highlighted quite nicely, I'd say, through the maps, the inequity that we all knew existed around, communities with the highest rates of unemployment, the highest rates of chronic health conditions, lack of access to grocery stores. And admittedly, we never talk about inequity within the emergency food system. And it exists in that system as well. 70% of partners who operate a food pantry, do so on shoestring budgets, a budget of $50,000 or less. Probably 40% of them don't have any paid staff. So they're operating with volunteers. And the pandemic highlighted the fragility of that. These are the heroes of this work alongside every single person, which I know some of you are either, listening on this call, but you may have operated a pop-up, worked with a local farmer. You did something to step up around this pandemic. We all witnessed what happened when, grocery stores shut down and don't serve. We know in some instances, grocery stores left communities before. So I think that, although we responded to the emergency well, I think it opened everyone's eyes and shined a spotlight around the idea that we have a food system that is inadequate, that does not serve the needs of the community fully. And we need to respond to that. And we have a window. And that's what I'm excited about, because we have so many people, donors, funders, volunteer supporters, who understand now. They recognize if they didn't understand it before, they understand it now. And they want to help us. They want to step up and figure out what they can do. And what this council was able to do, and thank you, Juan Sebastian. I think Juan Sebastian maybe have been with the city a few months. And we sort of laid this in his lap. We were like, hey, okay, we know we're still in a emergency, but let's start thinking about the long term. And he was up for it. Erica was up for it. Anton was up for it. And we didn't have it all figured out, but we were committed to a series of sprint meetings. I think I felt like we had a meeting every week. So I might be embellishing on that, but while people were simultaneously responding to the emergency, we were meeting every week about this council and what it could mean and what the hope around it could be. So I feel like this moment is different, and I'm excited about the possibilities. So Roger, is that what you had in mind?
That was perfect. Thank you. So we'll transition to some other partners who are engaged in the work and who are anchored and based in community efforts, and looking across the broad spectrum of food system work, from getting land available for urban gardens and farms to thinking about job opportunities and reactivating spaces, being mindful of development without gentrification communities, really being holistic in the whole perspective, and really seeing how food systems can be a key part of a lot of this work and working cross sector. So I'm going to start with Anton Seals with Grow Greater Inglewood. He's the lead steward and doing a lot of awesome work. So Anton, can you tell us, did you hear? Again, some of the things, the impacts that the pandemic has brought, but some of the opportunities that that's bringing, and the opportunities from this kind of new collaborative effort with the city.
So one, thank you for having me. Again, Anton Seals Jr., lead steward and co-convener of Grow Greater Inglewood. And, I think that I'll spend my time briefly, and then, Erica and I kind of twins in that way. We'll, we cover the zodiac that way, and for sure, the Aquarian Leo vibe. To get both ends of the spectrum in that way. But one, I want to just thank the city of Chicago for kind of stepping up in this capacity. I know we had been advocating, this particular administration to do something different from the prior. And just to give context, those of us who are advocates or, activists, or, what people usually default as activists, in our roles, in particular my role, or others who also are working with power structures, the status quo, in order to give voice for what we see are deficits and things that aren't working. So I do have to give some kudos there to Mayor Lightfoot's and Lightfoot's team for, taking this step and bringing folks to the table, and then what we need to then do next in terms of pushing it forward to make it something that is concretized within the government, given what Juan kind of laid out. I think that that's a big component that we can talk about in the open discussion in terms of these efforts that often are started, but then aren't concretized or codified in, our system. So the pandemic, though, I think just to spend some time there, I really wanted to talk about the cohesion that it has brought about, and the social cohesion. And I would also say, because this is couched in the framing of two things. One is around climate emergency that we are all experiencing as humans. And two, the kind of ongoing kind of racial, hierarchy, the system, that the pathology, and what I don't use kind of like white supremacy, or just the kind of, Western pathology, psychopathology that is, kind of spread across the world as the kind of mandatory thinking that has led to these deficits across all these different countries, with one similar thread around exploitation and extraction. It's like the feudal lords on tour, basically, is how I look at it. So I even bring it outside of just the racial component, because I think that it offers for, when we talk about white folks, there's a history before they were white, in terms of them also leaving their countries to come to America, and that promise for them. I think that also needs to be bundled in that. And so I think the pandemic has also brought all of those things to bear for us to have new conversations and new questions. In terms of the order, I think that there is a kind of nefarious way in which bureaucracies have worked and have been set up that prevent these kind of systems to, progress, so the kind of level of progressive nature of what we're all attempting to do is usually stymied by, these kind of trap doors that we have installed in when people say big government doesn't work. In one instance, I think that they're alluding to is that these kind of bureaucratic kind of circles in order to get something done. So in there, I think there's a lot of common ground or agreement in terms of how things are getting done. But I think that the framework in which how that is also within a racial context, because the way our system, in particular Chicago system, works is that it's benefiting a really small few, usually white ethnic groups that have built-in programs, and it's a system, so you don't even have to use race, but they are on all the short list, right? And in this particular city, the irony is that they are actually the minority. So the majority of the city is, Blacks and Mexicans, essentially. That is the population. That's the largesse of the taxing dollars in the city in terms of its residents. So, but that's not reflected. And then if I could just kind of talk about this food system component and what we're doing with Grow Greater Inglewood, and why, the kind of framing I was talking about is so important, is that you have, a few things moving at the same time. There's a city and a population that says they want more access to local food. And I think that is, barricaded by a few things. One is the definition of what local food is, this whole local food system. I think that is not something that is as consistent, and in particular in communities like Inglewood, where we're dealing in a different framework of survival, right? And ongoing generational kind of poverty and extraction. So you have to kind of, these are decisions, though. I think this is really important. We're at a critical juncture, not only in our city, but our country, around these choices we're making around this kind of, community murder, in a sense, that we know these things to be unhealthy. And we are still making choices that then have these disastrous kind of outcomes. And the people, some of us who live and are from these communities, are often in these spaces. So I think the pandemic has also highlighted that what we have is that we don't have a really good social fabric, and that we needed to strengthen that. So I think that that's where we've also gained a lot of allies, and what we're working through now is the language around where is our commonality, in particular around food system in terms of access to food. But it's not even access just to food, because what we've also learned is that it's not just you coming to get a food box. So we've done, pop-ups over the summer, trying to increase and advance more farms in communities where there are city-owned lots. So specifically in talking about the work we're doing in Inglewood, that process has been, man, I don't even have the words on a Friday to explain how difficult it is, and how, one is that the city doesn't have a clear viewpoint, given what Juan just laid out, all the different kind of layers that are there within the city of Chicago. So I think it's important to one highlight when we talk about wanting an urban ag district or advancing that, what government does well is infrastructure, right? And really getting infrastructure being done in a much more efficient way is what the city could be focusing on. And I think that that's where we're hopefully taking some of this work with the Food Council, with one of those pillars around, if we want to advance more Black and brown farmers and spaces, then we have to do some of the remediation, because this also comes back to then the level of which, the environment itself has been degraded to a space where, you then have to spend that kind of money. But, our argument to the city and to the larger public is that this is what the public should be making its investments in. So if I call the question like $250 million to police or $50 million to help clean up lots that have sat vacant for 30 years, you know what I mean? So those are the contrasts that usually advocates are talking about. I think in terms of and I'll just say in closing, and then I'm sure Erica will pick up on some of this in terms of the capitalization of food system and how to make money and jobs and careers at the urban level has been something that everyone's been trying to somewhat figure out. But I think the food system itself, so it's not just the growing of the food, it's the packaging, it's the the waste component, it's the transportation, it's all of those different components that I think that we have an opportunity to really look at in terms of not just an equity lens, but a real, and I'm going to use language that I heard the other day, a real economics reparations, a repair lens, right? Because that is much deeper than just equity. And I think these are nice terms, but I think that, I guess what I want also just the urgency in which we're dealing with these issues. They seem to sometimes be like, these are nice projects that people are doing, but in some places where there is not a real system, and there's a power shift that has to happen. And I think that what we're pulling together here in this conversation today and the work that we're doing with the city is to develop a new framework that is not as difficult, right? Is not as expensive, and that we come up together, right? Both those who are, in government, in community, in philanthropy, and business around a new kind of way, and then, really structured around a different set of values, which I think is, part of the ongoing conversation that we'll have. So, I mean, those are some of my early thoughts about some of the work we're doing here. And we'll dive back in more specifically once Erica talks, because she's got maybe a few slides we'll share. But then I just wanted to share that component, and then we'll have that open conversation. I hope that was good enough, Mr. Cooley.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much. Very appreciative. A lot of good visioning, but also some, dealing with the hard truths of the histories and realities that have gotten us here, and the systems and practices that are holding things in certain places, but really starting to think about what can we do to move forward. So wanted to switch over to Erica.
I just want to, while you're putting these slides up, and these slides are just as placeholders, I'm working through the lens of Urban Growers Collective, because we're working with, in one form or another, almost, I think, all of the groups that are doing active work, BIPOC focused work in Chicago. And this idea of collective, I think, is really what really came, and Professor Seals already shared this, really came to kind of coalescence through the crisis. I mean, and we had multiple crises hit at the same time. One of the things that I remember, it's probably 3 years ago, right when we transitioned from Growing Power Chicago to Urban Growers Collective, and there was like a Resilient Cities Rockefeller kind of think tanky thing at the South Shore Cultural Center, and we had to kind of respond. I think that's where I first met Nicole. We had to respond to different kind of, I don't know, disaster preparedness. What are the pressures? And the two that, the city really wanted the infrastructure thing. Oh, it's infrastructure. And what came out of the room of a very diverse group of folks was social issues and climate change and that intersectionality. And that has played itself out consistently. For me, I became very active in this work in Chicago in 2001. 2000, really, 9/11 triggered my understanding of how food insecure the entire system was. And that really pulled me back into my farming roots to work on that. Even though, I wanted to make art and do other kinds of things, it became a real passion because I saw, it was a basic epiphany. If you don't have food, if you don't have nutritionally dense food, if you don't have housing, if you don't have clean water, if you don't have good, basic stuff, you can't really function. And for us as a city to continue, even in this crisis, to not move quickly on a strategic plan that we can constantly activate when there's issues, and to build more resilient infrastructure at the community level that's coupled with city infrastructure, I think we're there. Like, there's a clear understanding that that is what is needed by all the players. So I'm very excited. And so everybody who's listening and, sometimes we have these days where we want to pull our hair out, where we're frustrated, we start to infight because everybody is so passionate and sees how we're so close. We have so much water here. Our greatest resource here is our people, and that we sit on this water, which is the new gold. And we have fertile soil, and we have fertile culture. We have everybody here. So we have just amazing opportunity to kind of showcase not only to our young people who are clearly struggling with all of these things, to see things degrade in the context of being able to really easily activate folks who want to do something. We had a huge missed opportunity last summer. And a lot of it was through, due to these structural issues, that folks lean on even in crisis, and that's unacceptable. So I just have to, in my little grandstand in town, so I gotta share that. I don't know, Roger, if you put these slides up, are you putting them up real quick? I thought that was up. So, this is our mission, and I think it's our collective is this is an emergent understanding. We understood coming in to this next kind of phase of our work, a 20-year arc. Every 20 years might be a good stamp of, let's try to redo NGO work and look at how we need to pivot, because you get kind of anchored, right? We have a city that was structured, and we know racism is structural. Structured, at a time when segregation was, alive and well. Things were established to make it very difficult if you didn't have the right person to call or the right, lever to push, that you could get anything done. And there's been, there's a lot of data around that. So within that context, we decided to reframe our work around these kind of core principles. The three things that are the most important that we're looking at, and I think they're not mutually exclusive. They really are integrated, is how we're training, mentoring, educating a new generation around food production and what it means within the context of social justice, equity, and really this important pivot around reparational response. So it is a reparational response to fund a project that is repairing either the climate degradation, environmental degradation, the lack of economic investment purposefully based on race, class, ethnicity, religion, whatever. So that to go back and repair that work is part of how we get to resilience. It's how we get to sustainability. It's how we actually can see momentum from this arc of philanthropy to reasonable and low interest capital, and to be able to begin investing in each other's work, right? Businesses, social response work, and to not, and I heard this early on in my career, to not brush off what doesn't seem to be impactful, because a backyard is impactful on that family. that's a food secure household, more food secure household. It's not the end all be all. It's part of a web. We used to say puzzle, but I really see it more as a web now, like a spider's web that has to be maintained and rebuilt every day, every cycle, and shifting depending on changing conditions. Roger, you can kind of slide through these because they're just there as context. Our ability as a squad to be responsive quickly was based on our experiences, and our experiences are not framed, weren't valuable because we had a lot of funding and resources over the years to do that work, but because we did that work already. And so it was like, okay, what can we do with these current conditions? What can we push together? Who's available? Let's try to do this. Let's try to recirculate these resources and create a dynamic where we could continue all the work that we always have to do, which is always emergency work, on top of variables, that unknown variables, and without understanding what was happening. And that was for all of us. And as a result of that, CIFPAC was incredibly instrumental in pulling us all together just to kind of link up, see where, this adage that always pops into my mind: get in where you fit in. Who's your squad? Who's working together? Who's already, aligned? Let's work together and support each other so that we can be not only emergency responders, but also moving forward into resilience and having economic sovereignty, having the ability to feed our communities how we define that, and to be able to tap in and support larger emergency web systems so that all of those pieces can, create, I'd say localized, decentralized, there's all these buzzwords, but community responses, and where people know about it. So whether it's like, I don't have enough money to make it from Monday to Friday when I get paid to feed my family that week, that I know I can go to this garden or this food pantry or this church or this whatever is going to be created for the future and get food. That shouldn't be a thing, right? That should be something that we're able to do on a consistent basis, and not be something that's looked at as impeding retail sales or other kinds of things. It's just a basic human right, not anything fancy, just a human right. Food, shelter, water. Go to the next one. You can just go through these quickly because I'm taking up too much time. This slide really kind of illustrates, this is not all the partners, but kind of the groupings. I think I covered almost everybody in different, networks and, collaborations, and all of the amazing work that quite a big, which, makes my heart very full. That there is now a whole new generation, I'd say 2 generations now, of folks that are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and inclusively we say that, who are doing this work, who get it, who are dedicated, and who want to do it at the community level. And that is, and the support that has been coming has been, I consider, reparational support, to make sure that those folks who want to do that work are anchored financially on land, have affordable housing, as anchors, as non-gentrifying anchors within communities that desperately need immediate support and recovery. And my kind of, in our partnership, I'm a we person, is this campus that's going to be developing, that's being built right now to create green energy and create compost at a scale that we can transform depleted lots and grow food waste in, food compost out. That's, this is a very expensive, it's taken me 10 years to do this. And it is the tales around this will be told because it's a really good example of very important work that no one can grow food without soil. Our soils are depleted and contaminated and have been ignored. And there are so many barriers that people in our groups have been contending with just to access land. I was fortunate to be at the right place at the right time to make a very strong argument around public land and parks. And that is the only reason that we've been able to develop in the city. honestly. And especially at a time when there were very few Black players and even there were no Latinx players at all, any indigenous folks. So that the arc that we're in is inspiring. Where we're going is inspiring. That we're at the forefront of agriculture and green energy in the country with this development. And it is due to the collective work of hundreds of people over this 20 years. Thousands probably, really. Supporters, folks who've been inspired, policymakers who were friendly and visionary and championed these crazy ideas, which aren't crazy now, but they seem crazy then. And investors who are willing to step up. And it's been a fascinating process. What I'm excited about, what this means for all of us, is that we now know we can start to look at vertical production at the community level. There's great examples across the city of commercial vertical indoor operations. Those aren't accessible by community. They're not accessible to groups like ours, even with this happening, because we know that for us to do the work that we do, we need to make sure everybody who wants to grow food can do so, and they need soil. So this is a problem-solving project that we hope that everybody is excited about and wants to participate in and build businesses around. And I thought it was important in this conversation to bring that into the kind of like where we're going, because that's why I was excited to participate, both as a current, leader, but a transitioning leader and creating space for the next generation, but also to be able to mentor and share lessons learned, the failures and the successes. I think that's incredibly important, and that we're doing that even within the context of how this council is operated, which was one of the most respectful and smooth processes I've ever participated in. Short and sweet. First thing I said was, I know you ain't doing another plan because I don't participate in like 4, and I'm still waiting to see the things I said to happen. And the fact that that was not only followed, it allowed this plan to accelerate and form the basis for the conversation is incredibly heartening. And yeah, so thank you. Sorry if I took a little too much time, but that's how I roll.
Oh, and we can throw this out to anybody to take on, but thinking about how this new effort that's coming from the city to be moving to thoughtful, coordinated policy efforts that's cutting across the silos of city departments and agencies, and cutting across and bringing together community input in a meaningful way that's able to then have access to the deeply embedded parts of the city that can be hard to reach, while giving feedback to kind of larger policy conversations and bringing resources to the table.
Is that an open-ended question, Roger?
Yeah.
The Zoom panels, we can't play off our energy. Well, I think just to center some of this, something that struck me that I just want to share with, the audience is just the concept that Bell Hooks talks about in terms of radical love and radical openness, and needing that because, coming into this work where we're dealing with, some real nasty stuff, and often can put people at odds, you know what I mean? But, one of the things reflecting on, that concept is that, when you're in love with someone, when is it ever not conflict? Like, when does that happen? And so it's like, yeah, that doesn't happen even, within your families. And how can we also, not be always in agreement around how we're going to see things, or that we're trying to convince, but that we have these other ideas that you may actually have an idea, but I don't necessarily agree with, 78% of even the other stuff that you're, so I think that's going to be a big part of, the successfulness of these kind of tables, because what we're dealing with is kind of like when we talk about structural those are attitudes and behaviors that are formed because that is just the way things have been. So I think that we need to make sure that we lean into that in terms of values that ground these kind of tables, even at the city level. Because if we don't reflect that back out, then what we're just doing is a kind of, a dance that, if and when the political, winds change, you're almost kind of starting over. And that's how it has felt and has been the history here in Chicago. So I think that's one. The other thing that I would just say is that this is also could be looked at because Chicago is such a food magnet in a way, even in a post-pandemic way in terms of its processing and all of that stuff, that, the system in our state or even in our local region, this urban, peri-urban and rural connectivity that and there may not be on here, but Black Oaks and other groups that are, been doing this kind of regenerative that are part of our families, that is where a lot of the Black and brown, or what we're now calling BIPOC groups can thrive. And I think that that's going to be really important to also think about ways in which we're able to support people in local communities and not make it so cumbersome. So it shouldn't be a 12-step process to, open up a food hub and have that be community led, or, you know what I mean? I think that we spend so much time, and I think that there's time that should be dedicated to things that, these larger concepts. So that's why I'm kind of hopeful in that way. Even, both as the structural piece of what will happen with this council at a city level, there's a whole nother component of that because of politics in the city itself that, could, railroad these kind of things. But the community, the folks who are gathered here today is just, I think that's where I have even the younger folks, now that I'm not as young as I was, who are now also very much active, the Catatumbos, the Getting Grown collectives, all of the folks who are, naturally coming together, trying to rewrite, these pieces. And I just feel us doing our part, and that they're going to also be picking up these parts that we're doing and continuing them. So those are kind of the things that I've been dwelling on that I think that are, inspiring, that gives us kind of that, because we still need that in order to push forward in this kind of work.
Hey, Anton, can I build on that hope you were talking about? Because I think about, I feel like we're setting an example as a group for what we want the city to be. Because when you think about the 6 pillars that Juan Sebastian explained in the upfront, we were individually working on our pillars. So I will say for the food depository, we were in our lane, we stayed in our lane, we didn't think about what was happening in the other lanes, and that wasn't right. So I think that, now we're looking and saying, how can we support growers and producers? So it's through this council, but it's also through our purchasing power. We buy food that goes into the community. So how do we support BIPOC growers in this?
And who are also growing healthy, nutritious, because that's the big component, is like that has to be there.
Exactly. We don't have to we don't have to buy from large produce facilities. We can buy from small community-based growers. So we want to be able to do that. How do we support Black and brown restaurateurs? Or why is it that there's no, there are very few Black and brown owned grocery stores in communities? How do we help support the paradigm around we don't need big box or a big box solution for every neighborhood? And what is a vision of a grocery store that a community wants? So those are the types of conversations that were happening. I think we also broke down silos across donors, because we have donors who say, well, we only fund emergency food, or we only fund urban agriculture. We were breaking down silos between developers that would just only talk to the business community around the development of a neighborhood store. So that's huge. that I don't want to take that for granted, that kind of all of that silo breaking has happened. And I'm very encouraged, I don't know if we mentioned that the number of city agencies that were at the table. So from Chicago Public Schools, the libraries, the Department of Planning, the business group, Juan Sebastian, there's probably several. Which one did you say, Anton?
Public health.
Public health, right. There were so many at the table, and I see the allyship that is happening that's very unique. But to Anton's point, we have to push ourselves on the policy. So one of the things that Juan Sebastian mentioned also around federal nutrition programs. So these are federally funded programs, whether it's around meals in schools, SNAP benefits. So the SNAP card we can all use in a grocery store. That's federal money that sometimes doesn't come into Chicago in the way that it should. And the example we shared in our meeting is that during the height of the pandemic, the city of Chicago lost $80 million in SNAP benefits. So that means that residents were eligible for SNAP who weren't connected and enrolled. So what this group talked about is, how do we break that down? How do we fix that? Because that's missed revenue for BIPOC businesses, and it's mixed support for communities just to be able to buy food. So how do we capitalize on that? And some of it is around how we communicate, who is sharing the message, who is the messenger? Is it someone in your neighborhood or community sharing that? And then how do we eliminate the barriers around connecting to these programs? So I just think that's another big piece, which makes me hopeful.
Erica, you were sharing about the Green Era. Thank you, Nicole and Anton, for those valuable perspectives. You were sharing about the Green Era project and recognizing that to get something like a project of that scale and scope off the ground requires capital, financial capital, to get over the hump, to be realized and manifested. And that for other folks to get into that pathway, what are some vehicles that you think might be required to help bring the the reparational scale of capital that's going to be needed to get to full state of equity, to, knowing that there's a 10-to-1 gap in investment in Black communities as there are in white communities in Chicago?
I think that's where the reparational, I don't say reparations because it's a much larger conversation. I say reparational intentionally. I tend to make up words because English is a little limiting for me most of the time. It was incredibly hard and it pretty much impossible to get capital without capital or collateral. It's impossible to get loans unless somebody signs for you, no matter what. CDFIs require it almost a little bit more rigorously than banks, because the banks give capital to the CDFIs to then loan to us, but they still require the same things that banks require. So that was a major gap. And so once I was in a space as a leader where, okay, I'm getting ready to capitalize something. Okay, let me go to philanthropy. Can philanthropy provide that collateral? And presented it to multiple, it's starting to turn, but it took 3-4 years of conversations and seeding the idea. Meantime, folks are struggling. We know we need more infrastructure. We need all these things for just to be baseline. So that baselining and understanding the gap, and and Anton is, I think, I give you your professor doctor status for this breakdown. It's brilliant. I actually would like to see it written. It is such a complex. It's a complex, codified, automatic kind of structure that it is so hard, even for folks who think that they're advocating within it. They are in it, and they're servants to it because they have to be, because it's the nature of how it operates. And so even if you come up with a brilliant idea that actually makes more sense, that would actually begin to disrupt poverty cycles, it's like, oh, we could do it like this. And then this would be a better investment than that money who I'm going to say, and some of the banks are old enough that, you know, the source of the money came from enslavement across the nation, and not just the South. The North benefited probably even more because of the textile mills and rum and all of these things. So there's the idea that the wealth of this country is just, it can't even be accessed by the ancestors that created the wealth. Like, we're the descendants of the folks who had the genius to do the work, the genetic fortitude to survive horror, and are still here. And we can't access capital to do repair work that's not even our problem, is a problem. And so as I look to my city government to be a partner in that work, that's how I've always approached the city. Like, oh, okay, well, I'm a citizen. I'm an active civic servant, really. I'm out here trying to do stuff, and I say it like that. There's better ways to say it now with the youngins. Y'all got the best, more accurate terminology that is a weapon in itself, which makes me, again, my heart sing. But to be in that mind frame where we're trying to do some stuff, and we're you know, and it's not even radical stuff. It's basic access to capital. Who's going to secure that capital? And should I have to pay that back ever? Perhaps it's I need this to catch up. It's reparational because there's a bandwidth issue. Even as smart as I am, I'm like, oh, there's all these things out here in the world. Oh, you all have that. Oh, that would make things so much easier. Just to know about what's available is a catch up. It is a reparational gap because we haven't had access to those things. The same way when years ago, when food desert terminology came on, I wasn't one of the folks that had issues with the term because I knew it was a stepping stone. It was not at all accurate completely, but it allowed people to see, oh, they don't have grocery stores like me in my neighborhood. Really? People just didn't know. Like that level of disconnection from what other people in the same city are going without in this age.
But Erica, if I could jump in here, because
I'm just going to go on and on because
I
am right now.
I want to deepen on this thing because it's, you know, Roger asked us to have this conversation around, you know, what is even taken to get this council or this even proposed structure to this place, you know. But for my entry point into food was through policy, specifically around the Farm Bill of, I think, 2007 it was, and working for a member of Congress and seeing how that language at that time, and, you know, that whole process, right? And what gets left on the, you know, what gets in there and what gets, you know, left on the floors. So the real sausage making of what gets inserted in the bill, the and or the that is a couple $100 million. And then programs and the kind of, so there's also the kind of intentionality of trying to, like, we're doing something good, but then a process that then, okay, I'm going to fork over this $150 million to the city and they'll dole it out. The city has no infrastructure to dole it out to people, like to the things you just said, which is that, you know, you are still a risk for even government money, which is in and of itself, because the people who are having those conversations and the decision makers, right, are not willing, right? They want to be able to choose the winners in that way and also choose the losers. So it's really important that you brought that up. And then this notion of, and I do think that on one end, it has brought much attention to, you know, the kind of food of, like, our whole system, right? Around food, you know, but the food desert piece did something that I thought, even then, working for Congressman Rush, and big ups to Congressman Rush, who kind of championed that stuff to the larger CBC, you know, in conjunction, in particular his role on the that subcommittee. So it was a little bit out of his scope because he wasn't, but he, you know, this was something that as a former Panther, you know, they started the free breakfast program, you know what I mean? And this is a response to the failure of what, you know, government then, you know, kind of takes that program. And that is something as an example that can be overhauled still, right? But my point is that what that bill ended up doing is underwriting corporations to return to spaces that they had abandoned. So I don't always think that people don't know. I think that there's also a question that people don't care. And I think that's a much different kind of radical openness that I'm trying to work on, because you're working with people who really sometimes just do not care. And often when you say these things in company where, and we're a mixed company in terms of race, but not in terms of place. We all live in the Chicagoland area. When you start talking about reparations, I've seen this in multiple different sectors. It's like, well, what do you want now? There's an attitude of that is in and of itself is the problem, right? That we can't even as a group acknowledge that there have been harms. I think that for some folks, they're like, people are making these personal decisions and choices just because, right? And that's a narrative that is being propagated. And, you know, that's a whole nother conversation. But I think it's important, as you were talking about that, Erica, around how these things spring up, because there was a lot of great intention, right? And then we put that out in the streets, and then people at our levels in the communities don't have the tools to access, you know, those grants, right? So they're not in competition, or they're going to be in competition with the city of Chicago that's going after this big grant to address issues in the community. And part of it is to still that the access to capital. This is where philanthropy comes in. And I think that we've made, of course, some inroads, because there are now groups like Grow Greater Inglewood that has emerged. But those things, of course, in the business world, these things take time. And in the quote unquote regular business world, they fail up. They'll lose $5 million overnight and not somebody even thinking about it. You know, so it's not the risk in which the layers in which we want to add strings to access to capital for the return on the investment. And in philanthropy, the return on investment is the story, to say that they're doing something good in place of what the government, the public, should be supporting. And so I think that those are tensions that we're still going to have to deal with, you know, in this council.
Great. Thank you, Erica Nanton, for digging into the resource piece.
Can I add one more thing though?
Yeah,
because I think that this is like the crux, because when you get into economics and you get into who has access to capital and not, and how decisions are made, there is a level of understanding of what's happening that most of us don't even have access to those conversations. And so knowing, oh, that's happening. Oh, let me put this building over here. Oh, there's some there's this. That folks who have that access can make strategic decisions about deployment of resources and manipulate even the work that we're doing. So as we mature, I think there's an opportunity to talk about that. And it's because it's not ultimately, somebody closes a deal and they make their money and then they move on. You know, that's sort of how the city kind of operates. And I think all cities operate. And we're saying that that can't happen that way anymore, because it's too extractive and the price is too high. The price is way too high. One life should be enough, but now it is ridiculous. And I want to keep that passion in the conversation and the heart in the situation, because people are suffering because of those ways how we do things. Or that frustration and response. We just narrowly escaped another cycle of Trump. It's terrifying. You know, and so like that, this is serious. We have the opportunity to make some real change and to really open up some conversations, not just because I get it. Let me donate to these Black and brown organizations for a second. Really, really understand that we know what we're talking about, and collectively we work. There's a reason. I'm gonna take it all the way back. There was a reason on plantations we weren't allowed to gather. There's a reason we were kept separate and pitted against each other, because once we were together, we can problem solve. You know, that's the village. It takes a village. That you know, yeah, it does, and we know how to do that. And when we're able to not be spinning our wheels, hustling and running around like chickens with their heads cut off, we can actually get some things done. And I'm gonna say it like that because I also think it's a cultural shift that needs to happen as well. What's acceptable, what's professional, who's ready to speak on behalf of the issues. All of those tropes and narratives are what disables us from being able to progress.
wanted to give Juan Sebastian a chance to reflect as part of the reflection and processing of the realities that have been shared and the extensive histories that we're all needing to work through to get to the vision of food equity in Chicago, and recognizing and seeing in the chat the conversations of how other decisions that are made in the city have direct impact in other communities, how TIF monies are allocated, how development decisions are being made. How can this council and the vision coming out of the mayor's office be to help looking at a more expansive and radical transformation?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Roger. And I feel like every time I'm in conversation with Erica and Anton and Nicole, I just find myself nodding a lot and wanting to hear more. And also, I think puts into perspective, helps put into perspective just like how long-term a lot of this work is and how much needs to be done on a structural level, on a cultural level, movement within government, outside government, obviously. So many pieces. So I don't actually know if I have a really good answer right now for your question, but I think but what I think I can offer or say is that what I find hopeful about this council is an opportunity to push on some of these edges and test what is doable from the existing structure side, because I think for just on like another point, right? I think Nicole may have mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I'm relatively newer to the city and to definitely to city government. A little less than a year. And so I know for myself, I'm also learning a lot about how these structures are set up and what the current structures are limited to do. Even in setting up this food council, as I've wanted to or tried to think about how can we set this up in a way that is sharing power, that is decentralizing, maybe coordinating, acting as a centralized coordinating point, but decentralizing decision making. Those are tough so far, right? Those are challenging things to operationalize or to figure out how to actually get them embedded into government, into code. So there's, I think, a lot of different points there's a lot of work that comes up that needs to be addressed through these conversations. My hope is that we can keep pushing on that we can increase transparency, that we can build a better collective understanding of how how decisions are made, how these decisions can impact or influence one another. I saw a good question, right, about how this council might sit with other tables at the city, and I don't really know if I have a good answer, but that is a very good question at least. So I don't know if that actually helps respond to some of the question that you've put up, but I think that there is a lot of pieces in here around building these relationships and finding these allies. I again, right, I feel like even just from the course of the couple workshops that we had, I know my understanding has been pushed on moving away, for example, away from thinking of food deserts in that very kind of flat or single dimensional way, and to have a better understanding of food apartheid overall. And so all those little pieces I see as incredible, as important parts of this general movement for a more equitable or just city. And my hope is that the council helps, bring along more city folks along this journey, helps make clear how these different decisions or structures are set up, because again, right, these structures have been in place, and I don't mean to, and I'm not trying to absolve myself of any responsibility being new to government, but these agencies, departments, and structures have been in place for centuries, right, for a long time, and they've been built on a large, long history of oppression and structural racism, right? And so undoing all that is a lot of work, and I won't pretend that this council can, solve all of that just by being formed or in a first year of work. But I know that it's important that it is focused on that, or that it has that kind of a lens.
Great,
So I'll
thanks.
pause there. I don't know if that, again, helps answer some of the
It's a
questions.
good conversation in the chat room happening, so that's a good thing. I mean, you hitting it on the head. Roger, you got some more questions for us, or because I don't want to.
Well, so as we're getting close to time,
Yeah.
Any kind of what brings you hope for 2021 out of the conversations that have come in the last year, the momentum that's been building up, the newer collaborations that have emerged?
I'll just answer that. I believe together we will win. I think that is, a chant that is, often used from a lot of my friends who are, out here, doing all types of good stuff in our environment. I think that, we knew that this day was going to come. That you're not going to, unpack, an oppressive system, overnight. So that, just right sizing the expectations. And this is, a protracted struggle. And I think that, but the foundation has been led. And I think that what the ultimate goal is that there is enough and staying in abundance, even though that sounds really flowery, that there is enough for everyone. There is really enough for everyone. So we have to kind of step back from these kind of notions that we all as Americans have gathered, because those are some of the things that are still some of the barriers that we're dealing with in terms of, when we talk about food access or food systems, a lot of that has been, ingrained in how we are actually thinking. So I think that, we will have, and I see I'm looking at the chat room too. So yeah, I think together we win. That's right, Baba O.
Erica, 2021 for you?
I mean, I already spoke about that. I mean, there's Baba Oren, who's, elder, has been doing this work and holding the flame up for many years. My hope is that folks have courage to speak the truth and be uncomfortable in this process, this transition process, that we should be looking at all businesses in Chicago and asking the question, are you extracting from the environment or from people? Just those two. I just like, is this going to be something that is going to be non-extractive on those two levels? And if businesses can't answer that correctly, then they have no business coming into our communities, because we have to pay for the cleanup. We're the citizens. So if an entity is being funded by the city on one hand to do something that's going to extract cheap labor, which means that people can't afford to live. They're not able to do the things they need to do. There's a public health cost, and the environment is somehow being disrupted. But those two things, that two-sided coin, needs to be tossed. And if it doesn't land exactly perfectly, then that should be, for the city, that should be a no. And I know there's revenue and there's all these other things, but I think most people want to live in a city where folks aren't paying to be screwed, to use, vulgar language. And I think that's a pretty simple Chicago style litmus that could be used for how we move forward. And that's what I think about. I talk about the Green Era Project. I'm like, my goal is to be able to generate capital without exploiting people or the environment, as a business, as a profit center, that it can model that and accelerate and transform how folks think of themselves within the community, and young people grow up seeing their genius manifest, and that there is revenue from that, and not having it to go through, and be codified by the dominant culture, which continues to happen to this day, right? To these conversations. So that's my hope. I'm very excited about it. I like to speak in reality terms, and just excited to learn more and to be able to be, for all of us to be our full selves, and to be able to bring our talents and to not worry about the rug being pulled up from under our feet, because we're pushing against those edges.
Thank you. Nicole, we'll give you the final word.
Sure. I actually see a question in the chat about how can we share our support towards this work. So I thank you, Amy, for asking that question. And that's actually what I want to leave us with. I think we've all articulated in our own way the fact that the fragility of our entire food system has been this way for far too long. And that we collectively want to fix it. So while we have this moment, we need everyone involved in this work. And what's different about this council is this isn't a secret group. Where only certain people have access to. We want to have transparency about what's happening. So there is a public document that's being put together to summarize the work of the group and where we are. So you're actually an insider in the sense that before we even have a formal document, you're hearing about it. So we're committed to having that. We are also committed, we're still working through, because it is a sort of shared decision-making model, working through how we have ongoing feedback across Chicago around what happens with this work. So we've talked about a resident advisory council and what that looks like. So we continue to get feedback. So I would say that stay tuned for those two things, because there will be a mechanism for people to give feedback and shape ideas and get involved in the ideas that you have a whole lot of passion for.
Great. Any other final words as we wrap our time?
Just ditto, echo, amen. All of that. I know I'm excited, hopeful for what we're building out, and eager to be as transparent about all of it as possible too. So, and actually just really grateful to be able to be doing this work with such great leaders too.
Yeah, we got more work to do, but I think we're ready. Spring is on the way, so let us all be encouraged.
Yes,
The seedlings are
We're not
popping.
quite out of the room, the weeds yet. It's good to see so many familiar faces, and as they say, the struggle continues. La tuna continua.
Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you all so much for your time and energy and passion for all of this work. Thanks for everybody for participating. Thanks for Lisa for the ASL services. Thank you for Leticia for the Spanish translations. Thank you for the A team, our accessibility team, all the volunteers and staff who pulled this together over the last couple of weeks. There will be more sessions tomorrow morning starting at 10:30. And then there'll be an afternoon closing session with another dynamic panel, which we're folks doing mutual aid and community work. So very excited for those as well tomorrow. Have a great evening. Enjoy your sunbathing time as we've got the warmth popping over 50. It's time for bikini weather. So we're all excited.
It's Chicago summer, huh?
Yeah.
Chicago summer. I must see a lot of shorts this weekend.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Tiffany.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.